this panel on war in the core. My name is Taylor Sear. I'm assistant professor of philosophy at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. I was just saying this before some of you joined, but this is my first ACTC conference. Last year would have been, and we would have hosted it here in Birmingham, but alas, the pandemic, which will be a theme in my paper today. My paper is going to be on C.S. Lewis's essay, Learning in Wartime. And so I've called it The Present Calamity in a True Perspective, which is a line from Lewis's essay. And it's an important theme, I think, for thinking about our own situation. So the plan is for me to give my paper, have a few minutes of Q&A, and then I'll introduce the next speaker, and we'll have Q&A after that, and then the final speaker and more Q&A. Okay, so again, the title of my paper, I don't have a handout or outline or anything, but I think it'll be relatively easy to follow along. The title is The Present Calamity in a True Perspective, C.S. Lewis on Learning in the Time of the Pandemic. On October 22nd, 1939, a month after Germany invaded Poland and began the Second World War, famed novelist and scholar of English literature, C.S. Lewis, delivered a talk at Oxford, more of a sermon, I suppose, entitled Learning in Wartime. The main aim of the talk was to defend the importance of scholarly pursuits, including by students, but also instructors, during times of global crises. But Lewis also offered advice about how to continue learning during troubling and stressful times. And many of us, both we who read and teach core texts, as well as our students, have experienced a troubling and stressful year in light of a global pandemic. Besides concerns about our health and safety, many of us have been forced to adapt to new teaching methods, whether online or masked and physically distanced in smaller numbers, or some combination of those. Lewis's message is especially relevant in our context, and it can serve as a good reminder to us and our students of how the vulnerability of the human condition bears on what we do. So in this short paper, I'll reflect on some passages from Lewis's talk, applying his points to our context. So Lewis begins by addressing students. He says, "A university is a society for the pursuit of learning. As students, you will be expected to make yourselves, or to start making yourselves, into what the Middle Ages called clerks, into philosophers, scientists, scholars, critics, or historians. And at first sight, this seems to be an odd thing to do during a great war. What is the use of beginning a task which we have so little chance of finishing? Or if we find ourselves should happen not to be interrupted by death or military service, why should we, indeed, how can we continue to take an interest in these placid occupations when the lives of our friends and the liberties of Europe are in the balance? Is it not like fiddling while Rome burns?" And that was the end of the quotation. When told to work from home in the middle of the spring semester of 2020, many of us were scrambling. For the vast majority of us, the best that we could do was simply to stay put, try to do our work. This task was complicated enough as many students were displaced from their campuses. Many professors had to watch their children, homeschool them, and teach their college courses online. But in addition to all that, I suspect that many of us felt odd, and perhaps still do to some extent, about sitting down and carrying out our own research, whether it's studying a Shakespearean sonnet or, in my case, writing a paper about free will. This feels out of place and perhaps unfitting. Are we not simply fiddling while Rome burns? But Lewis continues, and this is what I take to be his key insight. I think it important to try to see the present calamity in a true perspective. The war, or we might say the pandemic, creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. If men had postponed the search for knowledge and beauty until they were secure, the search would never have begun. We are mistaken when we compare war, or the pandemic, with normal life. Life has never been normal. Even those periods which we think most tranquil, like the 19th century, turn out on closer inspection to be full of crises, alarms, difficulties, emergencies. Plausible reasons have never been lacking for putting off all merely cultural activities until some imminent danger has been averted or some crying injustice put right. But humanity long ago chose to neglect those plausible reasons. They wanted knowledge and beauty now and would not wait for the suitable moment that never comes. Periclean Athens leaves us not only the Parthenon, but significantly the funeral oration. The insects have chosen a different line. They have sought first the material welfare and security of the hive, and presumably they have their reward. Men, or we should say human beings, are different. They propound mathematical theorems in beleaguered cities, conduct metaphysical arguments in condemned cells, make jokes on scaffolds, discuss the last new poem while advancing to the walls of Quebec, and comb their hair at Thermopylae. This is not panache, it is our nature. And that's the end of that passage. Here, Lewis says that calamity creates no absolutely new situation. This is not to say that nothing is different or that we should proceed with our work in exactly the same way as before. As I've already mentioned, life during the pandemic has introduced additional burdens, whether it's childcare or the difficulty of teaching remotely. Lewis's point is that if our work was important and worthwhile before the time of crisis, it remains so during the crisis. We're not always aware of the fragility of the human situation. It may now be at the forefront of our minds during a time of crisis, but our fragility was always there. It's tempting to think that as more and more people are vaccinated and the spread of the virus slows, things will return back to normal. But Lewis cautions us not to forget that life has never been normal in the sense of free from crisis. Despite the precariousness of the human condition, however, it's our nature, Lewis says, to pursue truth, knowledge, and beauty, even in the face of uncertainty and danger. Not only is it our nature to pursue these things, but as Lewis goes on to argue, these pursuits are valuable for us. In fact, Lewis goes on to say that our studies are a duty. And this is another passage. The learned life, then, is for some a duty. At the moment, it looks as if it was your duty. I'm well aware that there may seem to be an almost comic discrepancy between the high issues we've been considering and the immediate task you may be set down to, such as Anglo-Saxon sound laws or chemical formulae. But there is a similar shock awaiting us in every vocation. A young priest finds himself involved in choir treats, and a young subaltern in accounting for pots of jam. It is well that it should be so. It weeds out the vain, windy people and keeps in those who are both humble and tough. On that kind of difficulty, we need waste no sympathy. But the peculiar difficulty imposed on you by the war, or in our case, the pandemic, is another matter. And of it, I would again repeat what I have been saying in one form or another ever since I started. Do not let your nerves and emotions lead you into thinking your predicament more abnormal than it really is. That's the end of that passage. Again, if our present context is not different in kind, but only in degree from what we sometimes call normal life, then even the seemingly trivial pursuits of our academic lives should be seen as valuable. This applies to the student participating in discussion board threads, as well as to the teacher learning to use video conferencing technology. Lewis concludes with advice about how to continue one's scholarly pursuits in spite of the challenges. And there are helpful reminders for us and our students too, even as things look more and more like the so-called before times. Lewis says, the first enemy is excitement. The tendency to think and feel about the war, the pandemic, when we had intended to think about our work. The best defense is a recognition that in this, as in everything else, the war or the pandemic has not really raised up a new enemy, but only aggravated an old one. There are always plenty of rivals to our work. We are always falling in love or quarreling, looking for jobs or fearing to lose them, getting ill and recovering, following public affairs. If we let ourselves, we shall always be waiting for some distraction or other to end before we can really get down to our work. The only people who achieve much are those who want knowledge so badly that they seek it while the conditions are still unfavorable. Favorable conditions never come. There are, of course, moments when the pressure of the excitement is so great that only superhuman self-control could resist it. They come in both war, pandemic, and peace. We must do the best we can. That's the end of that quote. Lewis goes on to give more advice to Christians in particular, and I would recommend reading this to anyone who's interested. Lewis's point here, though, is simply that learning is valuable, and it's no less important during times of crisis. Our present context will not let us ignore the human condition, but like it or not, we're already in that condition. A global crisis does introduce new challenges, especially what Lewis calls excitement, the temptation to think only about the crisis and not about our work. For some of us, this is exacerbated by the news cycle, and in my case, Twitter, But of course, we can always find some distraction from our studies, and recognizing that distraction in our context as an old enemy in a new disguise can help us overcome it. Lewis would encourage us to do the things we found valuable before our present crisis. Read good fiction, study for an exam, write a research paper, finally finish that book. A pandemic may cause much damage, but don't let it keep you from your learning. All right, thanks. Thank you. So I didn't take too much time, so there's plenty of time for Q&A, and if there's not too many questions here, we can always move on to the next presentation. But are there any initial questions? Yeah, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and talk, Scott.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I think the reason I appreciate it, reasons I appreciate it are several here, and I'd like to explore them with what you think, and not just what C.S. Lewis thinks. You can go back and forth, okay? But I will start with a passage after you had read it. You basically were argued, or I think C.S. Lewis said, that what we want to pursue is knowledge and beauty. And then a little bit later, you said truth, knowledge, and beauty.
Mm.
Now, I'm not going to catch you up on truth, knowledge, and beauty versus knowledge and beauty, but I do, what I did notice in C.S. Lewis's treatment was that knowledge and beauty business. Now, I can imagine truth and beauty as a substitute for knowledge and beauty.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine truth being one form of knowledge. I'll follow Plato and just say that all knowledge is in some, all truth is knowledge, and for that matter, in a sense, all knowledge is truth, if you wish. And therefore, if you're going to be virtuous, you have to know, right? But what struck me about this presentation was the unusual absence, and it's not really an absence, but the seeming unusual absence of the discussion of the pursuit of the good, which I find refreshing. Okay. The reason I find this refreshing is because it lets air in for beauty, okay, which usually gets kind of sucked out. So enough of me. I'm curious about whether you think C.S. Lewis really is kind of emphasizing beauty as well as knowledge here.
Yeah, that's great set of questions and great reflection. Yeah, my own view is that there's value in the three of those: goodness, knowledge or truth, and beauty, and all of those make for valuable pursuits. I like the emphasis on beauty in Lewis, and as a scholar of literature and as someone who wrote some literature, I take it that was something that was of special importance to him. And in a way, I'm trying to apply Lewis's essay to our context, but also to make this point as secular as I can. And so I think leaving space for the pursuit of beauty, no matter what you take the good to be, I think was part of my aim. So that's why I think I emphasize the focus on truth and beauty. But I do take them all to be important. And I do wonder, and maybe this is the Plato in me talking, but I do wonder what it would mean for us to pursue truth and beauty apart from the good. Yeah, I'll just leave that as a kind of thought, but I would need to think about it more.
I will suggest one further thing. I think it's Shelley. Shelley's Defense of Poetry. You know it?
Sorry, Shelley's what?
Defense of Poetry. It's
I don't.
Okay, you might want to take a look at that if you're interested in beauty. And the reason for that is that fundamentally what Shelley does is he reconstructs the Platonic dialectic, and beauty is at the top with truth and goodness subordinate to beauty.
Mhm.
Okay, and that's how you get a defense of poetry out of this. So you might want to take a look at that if you want to pursue that. I'm just let me just put this differently for a second, because I'm just interested. Why are you interested in beauty?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this goes back to the Lewis point about this being part of our nature and not just panache, but I think we feel an instinctual drive to pursue beauty. So in a sense, like asking why I'm interested in it is, it's not really even a question I had occurred to me. It's sort of basic in my own life. And, I'm someone, I don't read a lot of poetry. I do really like novels and more into movies than any other form of art. But when I have um, these transcendent moments where I really do appreciate something as beautiful, they're some of the most memorable and I think powerful moments in my life. And so when I get that, it makes me want more of it, I suppose, but not in a sort of, I don't know, pleasure seeking sense. I recognize it as something that's transcendent even. So yeah, it's almost hard to answer, like why is it that I'm pursuing it? I feel it as an instinctual thing. I think, this is a point that Lewis makes elsewhere in this essay and in other of his works, but we feel this desire for beauty. And Lewis is really convinced, this is his theism talking, but he's really convinced that we wouldn't have any of these desires if they didn't have an object that was a fitting object of that desire. And I tend to think that's what beauty is pointing at. That's the Platonist and Lewisian in me, I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. Oh yeah, Robert.
Yeah, to continue where Scott's going, it seems to me Lewis is defending cultural life, and since he's talking to Oxford students, what high culture means for them is beauty and knowledge. But would you agree that what he's saying is just easily transferable to other things like defending making babies and raising kids and teaching them to read and going on family picnics? That's not usually what we call high culture, but
Right.
he's defending that even though there's a war going on. Would you agree or not?
Yes, totally agree, and that's a good point. And he uses examples like the person. What is he? I think I read a quotation where he talks about the priest and then the person with their jars. He gives other examples that I didn't quote of cultural pursuits, even not just in the academy, but in any domain of life. And I think he is. I mean, this is a very Protestant idea, the idea of like a calling or vocation, but any good way of living, any work that one's doing that can be seen as in service to God is going to become sort of holy in this view. So Lewis is very attuned to that. Thinks this isn't just for the poets among us. It's for everybody. Yeah. Yes. Is it Amy?
It is. This is my first Zoom call. So I don't know if I have a hand I'm supposed to raise or.
No, you could just start talking. That's fine. Yeah.
I have a few comments. One of them is that anytime that we pursue truth or beauty, we're pursuing goodness because those are just means to the end of goodness. And if you look up and start researching any question on the meaning of life for human beings in general, you're always going to get to this end of happiness because it always kind of ends there. That's what we always strive for. And so I think Lewis is just arguing here that don't stop pursuing these things toward your ends just because of wartime or just because of a conflict or something like that, that it's very important to continue to live this lifestyle where we are pursuing goodness. And I think he's not leaving out goodness. I think he's just kind of assuming that we all kind of feel like that's where it's leading toward anyway. I did have a question though, because anytime there is wartime, and this we know from just history, and Let's take, for example, the French Revolution. That's a really important one because that's when existentialism really came into the picture. And I think during wartime, we have all these situations where we have these families and people that can't concentrate on their life as it was because of all the excitement that war brings. But what they do instead is, in order to get back to their life, they focus on themselves as human beings. And it kind of brings in this existentialism in this natural way that kind of focuses on a self and why are we here and what are we doing. And I think my question for you is, do you think that C.S. Lewis is arguing by doing these things and sticking to goodness and sticking, I mean, not goodness, but sticking to truth and beauty, that he's kind of saying, don't just let the existentialism creep in, but stay with your Christian movement too, like bring in, because, you know, he's very Christian. And I wonder if he was kind of saying overall, by doing these things and always pursuing knowledge, that we're always keeping that Christian idea in mind as well. And so I was wondering if you thought maybe there was a link to that, him pursuing this during the wartime, that might have something to do with that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't see him as trying to sort of convince Christians to be careful to stay Christians or to be thinking about themselves as like at risk of falling into some other worldview or, you know, something like that. I do think he sees the war as raising special questions for Christians. Or at least it calls attention to a question that is, you know, very pressing for Christians, which is, if you think that, you know, we human beings are immortal beings and that how we live these lives affects the, you know, our eternal existence, right? The stakes just get so, you know, that we up the ante to the infinite degree. And so it's like, well, why would you spend time reading poetry if, you know, the eternal souls of, you know, your fellow humans are on the line? And once you have that in mind, he's like, well, a war is kind of, it might make it so that someone who was already definitely going to die is going to die sooner than they would have otherwise. But this pressing question of how we could be doing any of these things in the first place is sort of extra pressing for Christians. So I think that's where he's addressing Christians in particular. It's not so much like, don't let your, I don't know, don't let existential dread get the best of you and make you think, you know, we have to, I don't know, adopt some alternative worldview to Christianity, but like, it's a way of forcing us to come to terms with the human condition and what Christians believe about that condition. I don't know if that answered all of what you were asking, but that's my first thought.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Maybe, Taylor, maybe we should give others a chance to talk, but I do have a question that I'd like to come back to at some point.
Sure. Yeah, is there anyone else who has a question? Why don't you go ahead, Scott, and then yeah, after your question, we can let the next presenter go. And if, you know, I'm sure that given the common theme, you know, certain people will still have questions continue over.
Well, okay, towards the end, maybe not quite towards the end, you reiterated that, you know, the enemy is excitement about the war, right?
Yeah.
There are always rivals to work. Well, this strikes me as kind of a presumption of a defense against public pressure. Okay. You know, why isn't this like any call at any time right now? You know, why don't we, why isn't something like injustice, racial injustice, a urgent cry? And then how do you, you know, you can kind of presume you're on the right side in a war, but that isn't, you know, those of us who grew up during Vietnam, a little bit of question about that. So similarly, Is this a call to have faith in these scholarly teaching exercises independent of current circumstance?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think to that last question, yes, the call to pursue what we just might generally call scholarly pursuits, but pursuing truth and beauty in the various ways that we do as scholars, that is all important, even when there are pressing social issues that need addressing. I think he would say yes. I think he would also say that doesn't mean that we should only be reading the great books and then not taking into account our social circumstances and injustices wherever they occur. It's just that if we were to wait to start caring about our scholarly pursuits until there were no injustices to address, we would never start. And that's the worry that he wants to forestall. All right, thanks for all your questions. This has been really helpful and good reflection for me. We're about 30 minutes in, which is about 1/3 of our time, so it's a good time to transition. Our next speaker is Robert Anderson, who's going to be talking about the same essay by C.S. Lewis, Learning in Wartime or During COVID-19 is Anything Different? So I will turn it over to Robert.
I'll mute myself. Yeah, unfortunately, this is a 12-page sermon, and listen to two people talk about it for 15 minutes means you could have read it probably twice over. So this is kind of a weird exercise. I'll try not to repeat too much of what Taylor said. I think to start off, we want to agree with what he's up to here. It's rational consolation in the face of a very disillusioning crisis. And C.S. Lewis's first main point is that there are always these disillusioning crises, alarms, difficulties, emergencies, or just crying injustice. They're always there. And one of the first things I did when I was thinking about this was just ran through my 50 years of consciousness of crises and alarms and emergencies. Your list may be longer, different. I'm going to leave things off of it, but it wasn't too hard to just realize every couple of years of my life something very alarming has been going on. And so I can recall protests in March. I can give them specific names, but I'm just going to use the category. Riots, obviously ongoing, assassinations, school shootings, genocides, massacres, serial killings, public policy, wars, poverty, crime, drugs, terrorism, energy, oil, public policy wars on global warming, climate change, species extinction, dying coral reefs, topsoil erosion, algae blooms, acid rain, clubbing baby seals, commercial whaling, elephant slaughters, inflation, deflation, recession, stock market crashes, nuclear holocaust, nuclear winter, nuclear waste, nuclear reactor disasters, shooting wars, the Cold War, arms races, nuclear disarmament, flooding, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes Camille, Andrew, Katrina, Irma, Maria, Florence, Dorian, domestic terrorism, international terrorism, 9/11, famines, droughts, locust invasions, cancer, AIDS, the swine flu, Zika virus, Ebola, the bird flu, immigration and border problems, airplane crashes, space flight disasters, multi-car pileups, school bus crashes, train derailments, homelessness. And that wasn't even hard to come up with. I think you probably can produce similar lists. In the end, just as World War II did not, by Lewis's reckoning, change anything fundamental about human life, neither has COVID-19. It's just the most recent problem and distractor to rear its ugly head and to disillusion people. Lewis's specific way of defeating disillusionment caused by World War II is by diminishing it, as Taylor indicated. But it's not available, in my experience, to most college students, and I teach at a Catholic college. Lewis says that human life has always been lived during the worst and ultimate cataclysm. It's a catechism so great that it makes all other catastrophes, everything on the list, put all the whole list together, they all look puny in comparison. Namely, that human life has always been lived on the brink of heaven and hell. Consequently, so says Lewis, all human concerns and fears look, quite minute in comparison to people's eternal destiny. But personal immortality and eternal destiny barely register on the credibility meter of college students, in my experience. Thus, if Lewis's main point about the value of study, despite crisis, is still to have force, its moorings to the Christian tradition must be cut and new moorings must be made. And I think they can be made. And this is the way I would try to make them. Whether or not human life, however brief or long, glorious or mundane, virtuous or villainous, has consequences that echo into eternity, Lewis is correct that human life is filled with objects that are finite. They're not only limited in temporal size, they're not only limited in not being internal, though, they're also limited in the precise way that they are valuable, or the opposite, unvaluable. This limitation on values is sometimes called the incommensurability of basic human goods. It's basically an apples and orange problem. Friendship is good in a way different from life and health. Beauty is good in a way different from sport and craftsmanship. Knowledge is good in a way different from all of the previous, as well as from interpersonal harmony and a relationship with God. No good offers all that alternative goods offer, and that thus each of them appeals or attracts in ways that others do not. As a consequence, when Lewis says all finite objects are intrinsically unfitted to support the whole attention of a human soul, he's right in more ways than he realizes. Every good in this world is limited by the specific way that it is good. Thus, none of them are unqualifiedly the most important, the most valuable, or the greatest good. So too is Lewis right when he says that various distraction, however worthy might be the good at stake that's distracting one, cannot be all-consuming. To turn one's total attention and to direct all one's effort toward them would be fanatical, because doing so ignores the many other goods that are also in this world. Thus, commitment to knowledge via college studies during World War II or COVID, or during any other earth-shaking crisis, it's defensible, it's sensible. When I have asked students whether Lewis's sermon from 1939 has anything helpful to offer people living during whatever calamity is the calamity du jour, they overwhelmingly agree that it does. They say that the piece helps put the COVID pandemic in perspective, which is ironically exactly what Lewis himself says is the value of the study of history. We have no access to the future. The past is a good way to help us realize that the assumptions and so-called obvious truths of the present moment are nothing more, at least often nothing more, than temporary preferences or fashions. So they get out of this reading exactly what Lewis says is the value of studying history. They also do appreciate, like Taylor indicated, the three enemies that are particularly in need of combating during times like COVID-19: excitement, frustration, and fear. I'm not going to go through those again. But when I've asked students whether Lewis misses other enemies to study, to this life of academia, that are peculiar to COVID or any other calamity that we're living through at the time, they've come up with some interesting proposals. It's a good exercise for them to think, what might you add besides excitement, frustration, or despair and fear? And they've added things like boredom, anger, greed, and exhaustion. And those are worth exploring with students. What are they thinking? Are they, do they rise to the magnitude of Lewis's three enemies? A final strength and delight of learning in wartime is found throughout C.S. Lewis's writing, the little Easter eggs one finds along the way. One of the reasons many of us enjoy reading an author like Lewis is that his writings are rich with insights and precise verbal formulations of ideas that we have thought in some fashion, but never been able to articulate. Here are 8 little Easter eggs in learning in wartime that I really like. First, he gives a description and defense of the Christian intellectual life and tradition. You know, why bother? Who cares? Why is it worth defending? He's got this wonderful proportion that's worth thinking about. God's omnipresence is to being in place. So that ratio is in the same ratio as doing everything for the sake of God and carrying out one's ordinary activities. Third, he's got an interesting paradox. Though many things are worth dying for, none of them are worth living for. That is, exclusively living with an all-consuming effort. Another interesting paradox, lofty matters are filled mostly with the mundane. As Taylor indicated, he gives some practical guidelines on how to discern vocation in life. It's not just some mystical thing that you figure out in some mysterious way. He's got a wonderful on-point criticism of romanticism. He points out some of the pitfalls in the academic life, like hubris, like arrogance. And he punctures the myth about the possibility of an earthly utopia. In the end, the main point of learning in wartime, it's not profound. Rather, it's something more like wise and welcome words from an elder. Many of the truths captured in the sermon are like many other truths. They are not difficult to recognize, but they're difficult to live by. Students also enjoy this piece and find Lewis's advice to be timely and useful. Because Lewis's sermon is focused on social upheaval, it has been a good assignment for students during the social upheaval of COVID. And because upheaval is a universal part of the human situation, the sermon has been a good assignment for students before COVID, and I'll use it again after COVID. As one student wrote, the messages in Lewis's sermon are so relevant to life in today's society that it's almost as if he could see into the future while writing it.
Thank you, Robert. That was excellent. I don't think that there are so many people that I'll need to field questions, so you can just go in the order that you raise your hand or unmute yourselves. But we have a time for a Q&A for Robert.
I'm just curious what your assignment is, Robert. You were talking about an assignment that you use this text for?
Yeah, I like very open-ended assignments for something like this, just a response. What in this sermon do you agree with or disagree with? Maybe a little more specific during COVID. What does anything bring consolation to you, to students in the current circumstances? Often the more open an assignment like this is, because you're going to get good reactions to it, the better the different types of reactions you get. They're not going to complain it's too long or they couldn't understand it. Yeah, Scott, you're muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I don't think this is.
Oh, sorry. You just muted yourself, but maybe it's cutting in and out a little bit.
Oh, okay. So the host has unmuted me and now I'm unmuted. I want to pick up on a couple of things that came together right at the end. By the way, the list of disasters was wonderful, just totally wonderful. But you said truth, it's like a sermon. There are truths that aren't difficult to recognize, but they're difficult to live by. And then a little bit later, and at the very beginning, you saw this as an essay in consolation. And by that, I don't mean just simply, here is what you are to be consoled with, but rather a practice of consolation, if you wish. At least that's what I take your meaning to be. So I don't, maybe at a Catholic institution or maybe in a philosopher's class who knows something about the consolation of philosophy, it maybe consolation can happen. I don't think it's the response, whether even if it were excitement. I mean, as you said, boredom, anger, greed, exhaustion. Those are the responses. Angst. When will things return? When will I get my family back? That kind of business. My friends back. I'm wondering if the truths that are not difficult to recognize, but hard to live by, if they take the form of consolation, are they easier to live by? That is consolation, when we're introduced to it, inherently something that we can pick up more readily. I don't want to say easily, but more readily through something like a Cortex philosophic program than would be, I'm going to acquire I'm going to acquire phronesis to, make a real outside case. Am I making myself clear in asking this question?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the hope, that reason, like Plato says, will take charge of the other parts of the soul. But that's why it's hard to live by. As C.S. Lewis himself says, we're nervous creatures, we're passionate creatures, and reason just is, it's a quiet, it doesn't grab control and force the rest of us to follow in submission. And the more, you are a rational person and follow where reason takes you, the more it in fact is consoling. But that's not easy to be for any of us, 100% rational. We get excited, we get interested, we get angry, and despair. We have all these feelings that can take over. And it's why it's rational consolation. It may not be enough. May need grace, is what he actually thinks in many instances, and to actually do what you're supposed to do. And sometimes it may just be beyond us. The calamity is too great. It's too much of a disaster. We just don't have the wherewithal. But the hope is that reason can contribute to that effort to keep our sanity, maintain our dignity in the face of disaster.
Thank you.
I had one thought, which is I really liked the question you asked of your students of other enemies besides excitement and fear and frustration. And I too see a lot of boredom and exhaustion among students. I've never really talked about this with them as sort of enemies during time of crisis, but I'd like to reflect on that more. I've noticed that a lot of my students are more afraid of getting bored or not getting to have the social life that they wanted during college than they are about, say, contracting COVID, or perhaps even, ending up passing it on to their families or something like that. It's more a worry about their social lives. So I thought that was interesting and, worth reflecting on. I wonder, when you had these conversations with your students, was it in the context of what's new during COVID that maybe didn't apply, say, during other times of crisis? Or were you asking them about other enemies in any kind of crisis?
In this case, since COVID is the most recent crisis and the students, I'm drawing on them specifically, these apply to simply that. I've asked this before, and other things come up in other situations, but they haven't lived through many crises. They're 19, 20 years old. So this is the one that's vivid to them. And they're not very good at reflecting to what extent is exhaustion or boredom stopped you from being the student you're supposed to be, because they're really good at not being the student they're supposed to be all the time. So new obstacles don't register as particularly new. But being a little more experienced, I thought it was interesting as well to think about. I tend to think they're not quite as large as the three that Lewis has identified. They're, yeah, maybe as a freshman or sophomore, you get bored easily, but that's your problem. And you've had this problem a long time. And we're trying to educate you so you have these resources within yourself, a liberal education, that you're always occupied and engaged, and you don't need other people or gadgets or a new movie release to have something worthwhile to think about and to do. But I don't know. I mean, I try not to close my mind to what students say, as fast as they say it. So maybe there is more to some of their proposals. The greed one struck me as pretty trivial. What they were thinking about is people gobbling up all the toilet paper immediately after, the COVID shutdown. And okay, well, once you've filled your garage with toilet paper, I don't think you continued to be, this hoarding mentality. But I think some of them were worth continuing to think about.
That's good. Thanks.
I wonder if I could pick up on that a little bit. Do you mind me chiming in here, I'm thinking about what you're suggesting, Robert, with the students and anxiety or boredom, right? I mean, there's sort of the immediacy of the danger of COVID. There's the lethality of the danger of COVID, the mortality of it all. But, one thing that Lewis certainly has in the back of his mind, just given that he's such a great scholar and a theologian, are the problems of the thinking mind, the dangers of the academic way of dealing with the world. So students, now of course there's more than one kind of anxiety, there's more than one kind of boredom, but students, especially the smart ones, the really smart ones, I imagine are dealing with this quite a bit, struggling with overthinking, their lack of being occupied, their lack of authentic social life is unhealthy, right? I'm not sure there's really a question in there, but there's a struggle that maybe even of the heart that Lewis certainly would want us to attend to. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the liberal arts, it's not obvious whether the liberal arts can answer.
Are you in some way pulling the rug out from under Lewis and saying that the whole sermon perhaps is an exercise in academic arrogance, that rational consolation just is not the proper gruel in times like this? It's a different kind of consolation, and he's somehow fooling himself and others. Is that what you're suggesting?
I wouldn't take it that far. I would, however, forgive me, because part of what's on my mind, I'll be upfront, is the Doubting Thomas reading from the Gospel of John, right? When Christ returns to be with his apostles, he says, right, "Be not afraid, peace be with you." And if Lewis's concern is peace, which obviously it is, as contrasted with war, and given the Christian man that he is, there seems to be a kind of lack of peace for academics, and that's the lack of peace in our own heads. Again, not that there's a problem for everybody. I'm not making that claim, but I would say that Lewis knows that sometimes rational consolation might not be enough, or might not be the right solution. I'm not sure, but I'm always struck by his sensitivity to the Christian, but also to the heart in us. the hearts in all of us. If that is that a little more clear?
Yeah, that's really good.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it is a piece of rhetoric. He's addressing specific people. So it's always about measuring your audience. Does this audience need rational consolation? Do they need a hug? Do they just need a friendly ear to listen? There's no doubt that handing this to somebody who's had a loved one died of COVID isn't the right kind of consolation to offer them. But he wasn't, the students weren't in the war zone. The bombs weren't being dropped yet on London. At least I don't believe they were, not in the first 2 months of the war. So things were a lot more remote. Maybe a year or two later, he would have given a very different sort of sermon, and certainly if it was a different crowd, I would suspect it would be very different as well. But yeah, rational consolation is always limited. But it has its value.
Oh, it absolutely does. I just, I'm thinking back to even Scott's question or Amy's remarks about happiness, that well, whatever happiness is for Aristotle, and at the end of book 10 of the Ethics, some sort of rational contemplation being the highest form of human activity. Does it look like the same thing for Lewis? And if it does, or if it doesn't, what does it look like? There's something. I'm obviously inclined to think, no, he's always got some fallback that Aristotle never had. Or has.
Yeah, I think Lewis is more sensible than Aristotle on this. It's much more humane, the version of happiness that he has in mind, and it's ultimately ordered towards a Christian account of things. And so everything we're doing, and that's what he stresses, any walk of life can be in the service of God, and in any way can be ultimately what you're supposed to be really doing right here and now, whether it's cleaning toilets or fighting a war or studying at Oxford. It can all serve the same purpose, and none of them from the big picture that he's trying to see things from has any advantage over the other, which I'm turning around this notion of incommensurability of goods and saying, you don't have to go to the other world like he's doing, which I'm not in agreement with Aristotle in this. So contemplation isn't the highest good and the ultimate happiness. I'm more in agreement with Lewis here. There's different goods and different things fulfill happiness. And you can use a certain measuring stick and contemplation looks greater, but you can use a different measuring stick and another one looks greater. And the life of knowledge, scholarship is just one of those, but it doesn't have a privileged position over all the other goods and all the other forms of happiness.
Right, but please. If philosophical life or philosophical speculation is the highest activity for Aristotle or Plato, and therefore the happiest kind of activity, I guess I would say is that, well, happiness is a universal end for Lewis as well. And the question that the point I think he would make, again, don't know him as well as I'd like, but is that that happiness is the same for all people, in the sense that all people can be holy. Drawing.
I think Amy had a hand a second ago, and I didn't.
I think I saw that too. I was about to, but I saw her unmute herself. So please.
I just wanted to add some things. This is a really great conversation, so I appreciate you both bringing these topics up because it's really getting me to think here. One of the points that I wanted to make is that Aristotle and Plato had a very soul-centered idea of happiness. They didn't have a God-centered view that C.S. Lewis is coming in with because they weren't Christians. So they believed in the God, an almighty God. Gods, depends on who you're talking about. Plato had kind of two beliefs there. But overall, you're going to have a different picture. Like a God-centered view is going to lead us to more of a divine what am I trying to say here? Like a divine providence, right? That's going to have us really focused on what it is. Like everything that we do in our lives is focused on one goal, and that goal at the end is to be with God. Aristotle's goal was not divine providence. His goal was different. He had a soul-centered view, and so he believed that anything that you do had to be enriching and good for the soul, and so therefore, you know, so the soul would continue to be happy at the end of life and then into eternity or whatever. But I do think that Dylan has a really good point in the idea that when you take, like, when we have war is reality. That's what's really happening. You know, whether or not it's at our front door, and that might be the problem with humanity right now, is that just because it's not at our front door doesn't mean it's not happening. And we have this way of kind of turning our sight somewhere else whenever there is war in the world, like, oh, that's happening in India. Well, I don't know anything about there. So, and really, if you go back to before social media and all of that, we didn't really know what was happening in India. We didn't care, because I don't think that God, this is my own opinion here, meant for us to, because the way that we're all connected now is new. This is brand new stuff. I mean, I didn't know what was going on the other side of the country, nor did I care about it, because I didn't have to. All I had to care about was my town and the people in it and what was going on with me. And I think that C.S. Lewis, when he wrote this, you know, that was very much a reality still then, because like when we look at the world now, it's so big, and it really wasn't even back when he was doing this. You know, he has a much smaller version of don't get wrapped up into things that you are not directly involved in. And I think that that's a good point. And so Dolan has a great point too, that when we turn our, like, if you go back to the essay and you're talking about what he says about history, and I didn't write it down, Robert, so I'm sorry if I misquote you, but about history being temporary, if it teaches us anything, yes, war and these events are temporary events, and they kind of come and they go, but what doesn't change is our human progress. So I think what C.S. Lewis is really saying here is that we shouldn't turn our eyes away from war happening. We shouldn't ignore that it's happening, but that in the overall scheme of things, it is temporary, but what's not temporary is maybe the progression of human knowledge and where we're going to end up at the end. And I think that's maybe what he's focused on, instead of everything that's happening here now in the present, is just the overall goal of humanity in general, maybe, because he doesn't seem like the kind of guy that would say, ignore what's happening in the world. He seems more like the kind of guy that would say this is important to the whole human race, maybe. So just some thoughts toward what you guys were saying. I don't know if that's helpful or makes it worse. Don't know.
I doubt if C.S. Lewis believes in human progress like you're suggesting. I think he would go more the direction that every generation begins in the same boat. And each generation has to reclaim the goods that other generations have embraced or not. Nothing gets handed to us. There's no pile or package of goods that are really good that you can just hand to the next generation and they can take them and run. None of the ones that really matter, at least, not human, goodness, the change in their soul, not knowledge, not wisdom, some kind of overarching view. The real goods that matter, you can't hand health on to the next generation. The real goods that matter, every generation begins the same.
Just to briefly, I think it builds on what Amy was saying, as well as Robert, but some of your comments. Just to briefly return, maybe this will help summarize my first initial point, is that if it is true that Christ wants all of his disciples, that is to say, all human beings, to be at peace and to not have anxiety, then he's not just calling the academics to that. He wants everyone to be at peace, and not to have anxiety, to be consoled in and through him. So the question might be, okay, maybe not so much who is Lewis speaking to, but who is Lewis speaking as a scholar or as a pastor, I suppose, in that generic sense, as a Christian pastor. Not to say that those can't be in harmony. I'm just I was just trying to kind of go back to that baseline. And again, I'm serendipitous given that the Doubting Thomas reading was from last week. So thank you again for your time, everybody. It's wonderful panel so far.
I think we'll have more time if you all want to ask Robert anything else or me anything else, because I don't see our third presenter, Angel. Is Angel here? Doesn't look like it. So the last third of our time was supposed to be devoted to presentation from Angel Martin, but I don't see Angel. Well, unless anyone objects, I suppose what we could do is any further questions, whether for Robert or for me. I'm happy to take other questions or any other discussion. And then if there's not, we can end a little bit before the 5 o'clock or my 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock Eastern. Yeah, Robert.
I'd like to ask a question of you and the whole panel. I didn't mention it in Lewis, but it seems to me he's got a terrible argument along the way. And it's when he's talking about war causes this fear of death because it makes death aware to us, vivid to us, but it doesn't really change anything. It's 100% guarantee we're going to die. And he really downplays the idea that the young have a greater reason to fear death. Usually what we would say is, yeah, you fear death more when you're young because you miss out on a nice long life and all the good things in life. And he says, no, it's not that way, because whenever you're about to die, however many years you have behind you aren't going to make a hill of beans of difference, and it's not going to matter. So whenever it happens that you're going to die, the past doesn't matter. So you might as well be 90, or you might as well be 3 months in the crib. That just strikes me as a horrible argument. But what do you think? Do you think he's onto something there?
I tend to agree. He's overstating things. I mean, I think he's got the immortality of our souls in the background, and he's thinking like, yeah, when we have eternity in our minds, the difference between a few years, 90 years, it's inconsequential. But of course, it does make a difference to us, like not even like whether we fear death, but just how we think about our lives up to that point. If you live to your 80s or 90s and you can take stock, that's different than facing death as a 20-year-old or something. There's a difference in expectations. There's a difference in what kinds of goods you end up going without as a result of a premature death. So yeah, I think that's a bit quick on Lewis's part.
Why does he blunder so badly?
Yeah, I think the charitable thing to say is that he is thinking of that period of time in terms of the eternal perspective, and there it kind of makes sense what he's saying, but it's still a bit quick. Yeah.
I don't know. Based on what you just said, it seems to me that perhaps it's a U-shaped curve that you really don't, when you're really young, you wouldn't have time to build up fears of death. You wouldn't have time to build up all the things you necessarily want to experience or think you're going to miss. I guess it would depend on what metric you would use.
Right. Yeah, one of the main views in my neck of the woods in analytic philosophy on what it is that makes death bad for the person who dies, there's, Epicurus famously thought death isn't bad. The main rival view is that it's bad insofar as it deprives us of the good things that we would have had we not died then. And you're only in a position to recognize the goods you'll be deprived of after you've matured a certain amount and can look forward to the future and have expectations. So I think that does make sense of the U-shaped curve, at least in terms of our attitudes towards death.
I have a different way of looking at it too. I don't know where Lewis is speaking from. Maybe he is speaking from the divine providence side, where if your life is determined for you and it's predestined, then it really wouldn't matter how old you were, because you would have to accept the fact that God's going to take you when God decides to take you. So it's a freeing of the spirit to believe that way. I have a lot of friends that believe that way. I am not one of them, but I have talked to them a lot about it, and it is a freeing of the spirit that they have because they have to let go a little bit. But death comes with fear in the relationships that we carry with us. So that if we have relationships and connections here in the world, we're going to fear death more, not only because those people fear our death, but because we fear leaving them. And I think that is something that a lot of these, philosophers and stuff really haven't touched on a whole lot, is that we are connected to each other in the way, and we build our own fears in that way as well. And I think that if we were all loners, we probably really wouldn't be that afraid to die, because it's just a natural process. We see animals die all the time, so it's just a natural thing living things do. And I think we'd be a little bit more braver about it, accepting maybe. So
Can I just suggest that possibly thinking about erotic love at the age of 19 to 22 helps in appreciating the fear of death that 19 to 22-year-olds might encounter. They live more dangerous lives, partly through their behavior and partly because of what society frequently asks of them. And we could push that out to 30 or 32 or 3. So I'm wondering if there really isn't a cohort that, while they might take consolation, as both Taylor and Robert have been discussing, nevertheless, how to put it, the fear of death is bigger for the, poor word choice, but it's notwithstanding the fact that they may or may not look forward to whole careers. I mean, after all, it's very hard to imagine your career. It's very hard to see the house that you're going to buy. It's very hard to realize the happiness you're going to have. You can take steps in that direction. You can know that you're going in some right ways. But the more immediate goods are very personal, are very much about friendship and love. That's, your family, and who suddenly you found someone that you think, at least, might be someone you want to spend a life with. I think those are driven by serious pleasures and pains, and I think they lend a certain credence to young death, independent of any questions of a future, if that makes any sense here, within the question of consolation.
So you're disagreeing with C.S. Lewis as well, right, Scott?
I would think I am, but what I'm trying to do is pursue it.
Mhm.
I would think I am, but what I'm trying to do is pursue the question of whether this is kind of homogeneous. It doesn't really matter when you die,
Yeah.
okay? And if it does matter when you die, for whom does it really, for whom is the pain or, the rare case pleasure of death most likely to be felt and experienced? That's really, I guess, the question I'm asking, and whether consolation is an intervention here in a way beyond excitement. Okay. I mean, 2 years later, they're all getting bombed. 4 years later, they're dying on the shores of Normandy.
I mean, I don't know if this is convincing, but PTSD, I don't know if it makes sense unless you have real fears. Why would you be traumatized unless fear were somehow underlying all that? And PTSD obviously is a common thing in the younger rather than the more experienced. I think that would support your point, Scott, in some fashion.
I think a different way of saying this is, who are the people who have hope? They're the young. Hope is an enormous emotion when you're young. Not so much at middle age. And maybe not so much at 70, you know? Which isn't to say there aren't other emotions, but hope is a powerful, powerful emotion. And it looks to the future in ways that can't be known, but can certainly be felt as a pleasure or a pain.
Two thoughts. I'm not sure PTSD is always connected to a fear of death. And it can be connected to lots of other kinds of fears. And I just think it's interesting, Scott, for especially the initial age range that you offered. It's the teens and early 20s, it seems to me, that have the greatest illusion of invulnerability. So they may feel a lot of pleasure and pain, but a lot of them also think they're immune to death.
I think you're right, but I think it's shattering. It's for that reason, for what you just said. It's shattering to the young when there's a serious real escape, a near escape, or when they're on the brink of life and death, or I suppose it's true of everybody, but it seems to me that, how to put it, soldiers, police men and women, medics who return from these things after some experience don't seem to have those same delusions, you know? And they're still young. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just taking what you had said and acknowledging it, but I think there are these.
No, you're probably right. With those particular audiences, I can tell you from all of the frat boys that jump off of roofs around me in my neighborhood that haven't served or seen any true danger, that it could depend on life experience.
There's Scott, your comments lead me to bring in something. Taylor mentioned that he's a big fan of film. And what do wartime or war movies always are? They're always at pains to show the main character or characters in love before they die. Right? Erotic love seems to be that which they cling on to on the brink of death.
Well, aside from being stock, it might be true, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, aside from it just being a pleasing or attractive. And then to Stephanie, who was raising a very good point, I think we could also draw a parallel about the pandemic, meaning the young all over the country perhaps don't take it as seriously or as gravely as the old or the those with preconditions. But part of the problem is war is very concrete and immediate. This pandemic is strange in that it is not concrete and immediate. The ones who are actually seeing death, brutal deaths up close, are just the medical field, professionals in the medical field. We're not even allowed to visit our loved ones in the hospital. Why do we hate cancer? Because we see what it does to our best friends, to our families, all our lives. But who among us has seen someone die of COVID in a hospital bed? Very, very few. There's something to that as well, that where the analogy just practically doesn't stand up between war and this pandemic.
And I think to jump in, because Stephanie mentioned something in the chat, and I wanted to bring that up as well. In with what Dolan was saying, is that when we have all these great books programs and these classics and great books coming out, a lot of them do come out of tragedies. Like this was Angel's topic, so she mentioned approaching it. So, but it's kind of connected because we have these things that we need to understand, and that's where great books come from. You know, they come from the question of those philosophical questions that we deal with every day. What don't we know? Why don't we know this? You know, how can we figure things out and understand them better as human beings? And I think that kind of launched the programs. Now I have a whole nother tangent. I won't go on about where academia came from and what goals it had at different times, some good, some bad, and I won't go into that. But I do think that there is, when these programs came about, that there was a need to understand things, especially historical things. And I think that while we might be losing that a little bit now, because like I said, social media things make students think that they know everything about the world already. I think that we have a need for that. I think that what Dolan was bringing up, when we can't even see our when our loved ones dying in the hospital, is just one of those things. I mean, who knows how many programs or books might come out of the coronavirus, just because we've learned a lot. And back, like right now, one of the things I'm having the younger students read is the book called Fever, because I'm trying to teach them what a pandemic would look like in the past, like a real one where people were dying in the street. And so, and there is a huge difference. There's a huge difference on how we treat people, because even the sickest people 100 years ago, we would be at their bedside and we weren't afraid to die. We wanted to be with our loved ones more than we were afraid of death. And all of a sudden, everybody's afraid to die. You know, we plaster makeup all over our faces and try to look as young as possible for as long as possible. And nobody wants to die because everybody's afraid of it. So the goal of science right now is how to make us live as long as we can, maybe forever, so that we don't have to face death. So it's an interesting topic. That's all I had on it. If anybody wants to comment, like take us on a tangent, I'm sorry, I do that sometimes.
It reminds me of the very ancient philosophical idea that philosophy itself is preparation for dying, for death. I don't usually tell my students that that's what we're doing in my Cortex courses or in my philosophy courses, but I do think there's some truth to that.
Phaedo must come up in every conversation about death. If it doesn't, you know you failed. Phaedo's gotta be there.
Hi, if I may interject briefly, I have been listening with interest to your comments, and I was just wondering, the one comment that was made about the loss of hope in middle age or older age, was that connected to the lack of fear of death? I had a comment, but I wasn't sure if I understood that correctly. I don't
Scott,
remember.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, man. Scott, unfortunately, he's the one who raised that point, but he's not here. I think Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I think he was saying more or less that simply as a matter of living, the young have more to hope for.
Right. So then that kind of hope is connected to they have more illusions, right? So it's more of a, so we lose our illusions in middle age and old age. So it was not necessarily the most positive view of hope. It was more connected to illusions.
I'm not sure. I thought it was saying more like simply by virtue of getting older, you have less time and therefore less to look forward to. But I could be wrong.
And so I think he was saying that death is should be most fearful to the young if they have brains enough to realize their own position, namely their hopes are about to be dashed if they die, so they should actually feel it more forcefully, whether they do or not. He's pushing back against C.S. Lewis, that the young have no more reason to fear death than anyone else, and saying actually no, they have more reason because they have all these high hopes versus they're not just resigned like so many others.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I don't know. I feel like in the past few years, my students are more hopeless than they were 20 years ago. They're worried about global problems, so, and yeah, I think sometimes the richer life you have had, as I think Amy was saying, you've got those connections. You almost have more to lose if you see it as a loss than if you have, yeah, it just depends on whether you're looking at the future of what you have to lose if you don't get it, or you're looking at the past, what you have to lose because of the relationships you've built.
Right, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that perhaps there's more illusion in the younger age, and by middle age and on, we shed those illusions, and the kind of hope that emerges is closer to the more authentic Christian hope, I guess. And we have a different way to relate to the rest of our lives in that way, that life becomes more precious because we have a different understanding of what's precious and valuable about life, because we have less illusion.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes more. Did anyone have any other comments or questions that you wanted to bring up? All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for participating, and thanks for listening and for the contributions to the discussion.